Hello there, everyone. Welcome back to In Search of the Miraculous, Ouspensky's account of his time spent with George Gurdjieff, and we're coming to the end of that time together now. And if you want to learn more about Ouspensky's life after he left Gurdjieff, you're going to need to read some other material, some other authors' tellings of Ouspensky's fate, if you like. But yeah, we're coming to the end now. 2 chapters to go. There's a chance I might read chapter 18 later on today if I can find the time. But yeah, things are becoming more tense. The situation in Russia is becoming more difficult, and ultimately, if you know about the chronology of Gurdjieff's life, he ends up going to France, and Ouspensky is invited to France, but for some reason chooses not to go, and for his own reasons, I'm sure. And perhaps that's the reason for his decline, because he didn't go and spend time with Gurdjieff and continue his work and his efforts. But in this chapter, I'll read the contents in a moment. We begin with the super efforts and how important that is, and schoolwork, of course, which we've covered previously. We also speak about different types and astrology and how the centers should mold together. And at the end, he speaks about the Obivatel, I believe it's pronounced. I don't know the exact pronunciation, but hello there, Zanya. It's lovely to see you, and I'm glad you can come on at such short notice and enjoy the reading. So yeah, let me just tell you what we will learn about in chapter 17, and then I'll get into the text. August 1917, the 6 weeks at Essentuki, G unfolds the plan of the whole work. Schools are imperative, super efforts. The unison of centers is the chief difficulty in work on oneself. Man the slave of his body, wastages of energy from unnecessary muscular tension. G shows exercises for muscular control and relaxation. The stop exercise, the demands of stop. G relates a case of stop in Central Asia. The influence of stop at Essentuki. The habit of talking, an experiment in fasting. What is sin? G shows exercise in attention, an experiment in breathing. And I'll let you just read on the rest there, and if you want to pause it, if you're watching in catch up, of course you can pause it. But just briefly, in this chapter we receive several different exercises, and of course there's the stop exercise, which one is unable to do on their own. One needs a teacher or someone running the exercise, if you like, to say the stop, but you'll learn a lot more about it as we go through the chapter. But yeah, a lot of information, dense chapter again. But like you say, you can feel from the energy of Ouspensky in his writing that things are winding down. His time with Gurdjieff, the situation in Russia is becoming more treacherous. And so, yeah, Ouspensky almost knows, or I mean, it's after the fact, he's writing the book, but in the words, he knows that his time with Gurdjieff is coming to an end. So this is chapter 17 of P.D. Ouspensky's In Search of the Miraculous. I always have a very strange feeling when I remember this period. On this occasion, we spent about 6 weeks in Essentuki, but this now seems to be altogether incredible. Whenever I chance to speak with any one of those who were there, they can hardly believe that it lasted only 6 weeks. It would be difficult even in 6 years to find room for everything that was connected with this time. To such an extent was it filled. Half of our number, myself among them, lived throughout this period with G in a small house on the outskirts of the village. The others came in the morning and stayed late into the night. We went to bed very late and got up very early. We slept for 4 hours, at the most 5. We did all the housework, and the rest of the time was occupied with exercises of which I will speak later. G several times arranged excursions to Kislovodsk, Yelensnovodsk, Pietrogorsk, Beshtau, and so on, and forgive my pronunciations of those places. G superintended the kitchen and often prepared dinner himself. He proved to be a wonderful cook and knew hundreds of remarkable Eastern dishes. Every day we had dinner in the style of some Eastern country. We ate Tibetan, Persian, and other dishes. I'm not attempting to describe everything that took place in Essentuki. A whole book would have to be written in order to do this. G led us at a fast pace, without losing a single minute. He explained many things during our walks while music was being played in the Essentuki Park and in the midst of housework. So, just a brief comment that you could argue that this time in Essentuki, Gurdjieff was, in a sense, trialing what he planned to do in France, Fontainebleau, in the work that people were doing, not only the outer work, what Ouspensky's just described there, but also the inner work that is required to operate at such a sort of high intensity. In general, during the short period of our stay at Essentuki, G unfolded to us the plan of the whole work. We saw the beginning of all the methods, the beginnings of all the ideas, their links, their connections and direction. Many things remained obscure for us, many things we did not rightly understand. Quite the contrary, but in any case we were given some general propositions by which I thought we could be guided later on. All the ideas we had come to know up to that time brought us face to face with a whole series of questions connected with the practical realization of work on oneself, and naturally they evoked many discussions among the members of our group. G always took part in these discussions and explained different aspects of the organization of schools. Schools are imperative, he once said, first of all because of the complexity of man's organization. A man is unable to keep watch on the whole of himself, that is, all his different sides. Only school can do this, school methods, school discipline. A man is much too lazy. He will do a great deal without the proper intensity, or he will do nothing at all while thinking that he is doing something. He will work with intensity on something that does not need intensity, and will let those moments pass by when intensity is imperative. Then he spares himself. He is afraid of doing anything unpleasant. He will never attain the necessary intensity by himself. If you have observed yourselves in a proper way, you will agree with this. If a man sets himself a task of some sort, he very quickly begins to be indulgent with himself. He tries to accomplish his task in the easiest way possible, and so on. This is not work. In work, only super efforts are counted, that is, beyond the normal, beyond the necessary. Ordinary efforts are not counted. What is meant by super effort? Someone asked. It means an effort beyond the effort that is necessary to achieve a given purpose, said G. Imagine that I have been walking all day and am very tired. The weather is bad, it is raining and cold. In the evening I arrive home. I have walked perhaps 25 miles. In the house there is supper. It is warm and pleasant. But instead of sitting down to supper, I go out into the rain again and decide to walk another 2 miles along the road and then return home. This would be a super effort. While I was going home, it was simply an effort, and this does not count. I was on my way home. The cold, hunger, the rain, all this made me walk. In the other case, I walk because I myself decide to do so. This kind of super effort becomes still more difficult when I do not decide upon it myself, but obey a teacher who at an unexpected moment requires from me to make fresh efforts when I have decided that efforts for the day are over. Another form of super effort is carrying out any kind of work at a faster rate than is called for by the nature of this work. You are doing something. Well, let us say you are washing up or chopping wood. You have an hour's work. Do it in half an hour. This will be a super effort. But in actual practice, a man can never bring himself to make super efforts consecutively or for a long time. To do this, another person's will is necessary, which would have no pity and which would have method. If a man were able to work on himself, everything would be very simple and schools would be unnecessary. But he cannot, and the reason for this lie very deep in his nature. I will leave for the moment his insincerity with himself, the perpetual lies he tells himself, and so on, and take only the division of the centers. This alone makes independent work on himself impossible for a man. You must understand that the three principal centers, the thinking, the emotional, and the moving, are connected together and, in a normal man, they are always working in unison. This unison is what presents the chief difficulty in work on oneself. What is meant by this unison? It means that a definite work of the thinking center is connected with a definite work of the emotional and moving centers. That is to say, that a certain kind of thought is inevitably connected with a certain kind of emotion or mental state, and with a certain kind of movement or posture, and one invokes the other. That is, a certain kind of emotion or mental state evokes certain movements or postures and certain thoughts, and a certain kind of movement or posture evokes certain emotions or mental states, and so forth. Everything is connected, and one thing cannot exist without another thing. Now imagine that a man decides to think in a new way, but he feels in the old way. Imagine that he dislikes R. He pointed to one of those present. This dislike of R immediately arouses old thoughts, and he forgets his decision to think in a new way. Or let us suppose that he is accustomed to smoking cigarettes while he is thinking. This is a moving habit. He decides to think in a new way. He begins to smoke a cigarette and thinks in the old way without noticing it. The habitual movement of lighting a cigarette has turned his thoughts round to the old tune. You must remember that a man can never break this accordance by himself. Another man's will is necessary, and a stick is necessary. All that a man who wants to work on himself can do at a certain stage of his work is to obey. He can do nothing by himself. More than anything else, he needs constant supervision and observation. He cannot observe himself constantly. Then he needs definite rules and definite rules, the fulfillment of which needs, in the first place, a certain kind of self-remembering, and which, in the second place, helps in the struggle with habits. A man cannot do all this by himself. In life, everything is always arranged far too comfortably for man to work. In a school, a man finds himself among other people who are not of his own choosing, and with whom perhaps it is very difficult to live and work, and usually in uncomfortable and unaccustomed conditions. This creates tension between him and the others, and this tension is also indispensable because it gradually chips away his sharp edges, or even sharp angles. Then work on moving center can only be properly organized in a school. As I've already said, the wrong, independent or automatic work of the moving center deprives the other centers of support, and they involuntarily follow the moving center. Often, therefore, the sole possibility of making the other centers work in a new way is to begin with the moving center, that is, with the body. A body which is lazy, automatic, and full of stupid habits stops any kind of work. But theories exist, said one of us, that man ought to develop the spiritual and moral side of his nature, and that if he attains results in this direction, there will be no obstacles on the part of the body. Is this possible or not? Both yes and no, said G. The whole point is in the if. If a man attains perfection of a moral and spiritual nature without hindrance on the part of the body will not interfere with further achievements. But unfortunately, this never occurs, because the body interferes at every step, interferes by its automatism, its attachment to habits, and chiefly by its wrong functioning. If the development of the moral and spiritual nature without interference on the part of the body is theoretically possible, it is possible only in the case of an ideal functioning of the body, and who is able to say that his body functions ideally? And besides, there is deception in the very words, moral and spiritual themselves. I have often enough explained before that in speaking of machines, one cannot begin with their morality or their spirituality, but that one must begin with their mechanicalness and the laws governing this mechanicalness. The being of man number 1, number 2, and number 3 is the being of machines which are able to cease being machines, but which have not ceased being machines. But is it not possible for a man to be at once transposed to another stage of being by a wave of emotion? Someone asked. I do not know, said G. We are again talking in different languages. A wave of emotion is indispensable, but it cannot change moving habits. It cannot of itself make centers work rightly, which all their lives have been working wrongly. To change and repair this demands separate, special, and lengthy work. Then you say, transpose a man to another level of being. But from this point of view, a man does not exist for me. There is a complex mechanism consisting of a whole series of complex parts. A wave of emotion takes place in one part, but the other parts may not be affected by it at all. No miracles are possible in a machine. It is a miracle enough that a machine is able to change. But you want all laws to be violated. What of the robber on the cross? Asked one of those present. Is there anything in this or not? That is another thing entirely, said G, and it illustrates an altogether different idea. In the first place, it took place on the cross, that is, in the midst of terrible sufferings to which ordinary life holds nothing equal. Secondly, it was at the moment of death. This refers to the idea of man's last thoughts and feelings at the moment of death. In life, these pass by. They are replaced by other habitual thoughts. There can be no prolonged wave of emotion in life, and therefore it cannot give rise to a change of being. And it must be further understood that we are not speaking of exceptions or accidents which may or may not occur, but of general principles of what happens every day to every one. Ordinary man, even if he comes to the conclusion that work on himself is indispensable, is the slave of his body. He is not only the slave of the recognized and visible activity of the body, but the slave of the unrecognized and the invisible activities of the body, and it is precisely these which hold him in their power. Therefore, when a man decides to struggle for freedom, he has first of all to struggle with his own body. I will now point out to you only one aspect of the functioning of the body which it is indispensable to regulate in any event. So long as this functioning goes on in a wrong way, no other kind of work, either moral or spiritual, can go on in a right way. You will remember that when we spoke of the work of the three-story factory, I pointed out to you that most of the energy produced by the factory is wasted uselessly. Among other things, energy is wasted on unnecessary muscular tension. This unnecessary muscular tension eats up an enormous amount of energy, and with work on oneself, attention must first be turned to this. In speaking of the work of the factory in general, it is indispensable to establish that it is necessary to stop useless waste before there can be any sense in increasing the production. If production is increased while this useless waste remains unchecked, and nothing is done to stop it, the new energy produced will merely increase this useless waste, and may even give rise to a phenomenon of an unhealthy kind. Therefore, one of the first things a man must learn previous to any physical work on himself is to observe and feel muscular tension and to be able to relax the muscles when it is necessary, that is to say, chiefly to relax unnecessary tension of the muscles. And here we come to several exercises, I believe, about this. In this connection, G showed us a number of different exercises for obtaining control over muscular tension, and he showed us certain postures adopted in schools when praying or contemplating, which a man can only adopt if he learns to relax unnecessary tension of the muscles. Among them was the so-called posture of Buddha, with feet resting on the knees, and another still more difficult posture which he could adopt to perfection, and which we were able to imitate only very approximately. And so I think that the modern term would be full lotus, or Padmasana, I think it is in Sanskrit, but full lotus, where your feet are on your knees. And again, you need to have agile hips in order to get into that posture and to be able to relax, as Gurdjieff saying, and I myself am unable. To adopt this posture, G kneeled down and then sat on his heels, without boots, with feet closely pressed together. It was very difficult even to sit on one's heels in this way for more than a minute or two. Then he raised his arms and, holding them out on a level with his shoulder, he slowly bent himself backwards and lay on the ground while his legs, bent at the knees, remained pressed beneath him. Having lain in this position for a certain time, he just as slowly raised himself up with arms outstretched. Then he again lay down, and so on. He gave us many exercises for gradually relaxing the muscles, always beginning with the muscles of the face, as well as exercises for feeling the hands, the feet, the fingers, and so on at will. The idea of the necessity of relaxing the muscles was not actually a new one, but G's explanation that relaxing the muscles of the body should begin with the muscles of the face was quite new to me. I had never come across this in books on yoga or in literature on physiology. Very interesting was the exercise with a circular circular sensation, as G called it. A man lies on his back on the floor, trying to relax his muscles. He then concentrates his attention on trying to sense his nose. When he begins to sense his nose, the man then transfers his attention and tries to sense his ear. When this is achieved, he transfers his attention to the right foot. From the right foot to the left, then to the left hand, then to the left ear and back again to the nose, and so on. All this interested me particularly because certain experiments I had carried out had led me long ago to conclude that physical states, which are connected with new psychological experiments, begin with feeling the pulse throughout the whole body, which is what we do not feel in ordinary conditions. In this connection, the pulse is felt at once in all parts of the body as one stroke. In my own personal experiments, feeling the pulsation throughout the whole body was brought about, for instance, by certain breathing exercises connected with several days of fasting. I came to no definite results whatever in my own experiments, but there remains with me the deep conviction that control over the body begins with acquiring control over the pulse. Acquiring for a short time the possibility of regulating, quickening and slowing the pulse, I was able to slow down or quicken the heartbeat, and this in its turn gave me very interesting psychological results. I understood in a general way that control over the heart could not come from the heart muscles, but that it depended upon controlling the pulse, the second stroke, or the big heart, and G had explained a great deal to me in pointing out that control over the second heart depends upon controlling the tensions of the muscles, because we do not possess this control chiefly in consequence of the wrong and irregular tension of various groups of muscles. Exercises in relaxing the muscles which we began to perform gave very interesting results to some of our company. Thus, one of us was suddenly able to stop a bad neuralgic pain in his arm by relaxing his muscles. Then relaxation of the muscles had an immense significance in proper sleep, and whoever did exercise in relaxation seriously very quickly noticed that his sleep became sounder and that he needed fewer hours of sleep. In this connection, G showed us an exercise that was quite new for us, without which, according to him, it was impossible to master moving nature. This was, as he called it, the stop exercise. And just before we move on to the stop exercise, I'll just speak quickly about how I feel, it's my opinion, that sort of modern life, this fight or flight that we get from social media, how we feel inadequate when we're scrolling because everyone's, putting their best lives on there. I feel that this increases our tension. We, of course, if one is asleep, acting automatically and mechanically, you won't feel how tense you are. But I think you can see it if you go out on the street or to a busy town or a capital of a country and look around. You can sort of, if you're very observant, you can see this increased tension. Not in everyone, but there's be certain people where you can sort of feel or see and sense how tense they are. And I believe this modern world, it doesn't engender much relaxation, freedom and peace. It wants everyone wound up to the limit. My 2 pennies worth there. And yeah, now we come to the stop exercise. And I don't know if anyone's ever experienced the stop exercise, but sort of you need to really sort of go all in. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it, like Gurdjieff often says. Back to the text. Every race, he said, every nation, every epoch, every country, every class, every profession has its own definite number of postures and movements. These movements and postures as things which are the most permanent and unchangeable in man, control his form of thought and his form of feeling. But a man never makes use of even all the postures and movements possible for him. In accordance with his individuality, a man takes only a certain number of the postures and movements possible for him, so that each individual man's repertory of postures and movements is very limited. The character of the movements and postures in every epoch, in every race, and in every class is indissolubly connected with definite forms of thinking and feeling. A man is unable to change the form of his thinking or his feeling until he has changed his repertory of postures and movements. The forms of thinking and feeling can be called the postures and movements of thinking and feeling. Every man has a definite number of thinking and feeling postures and movements. Moreover, moving, thinking, and feeling postures are connected with one another in a man, and he can never move out of his repertory of thinking and feeling postures unless he changes his moving postures. An analysis of man's thoughts and feelings and a study of his moving functions, arranged in a certain way, show that every one of our movements, voluntary or involuntary, is an unconscious transition from one posture to another, both equally mechanical. It is illusion to say our movements are voluntary, all our movements are automatic. Our thoughts and feelings are just as automatic. The automatism of thought and feeling is definitely connected with the automatism of movement. One cannot be changed without the other, so that if a man's attention is concentrated, let us say, on changing automatic thoughts, then habitual movements and habitual postures will interfere with this new course of thought by attaching to it old habitual associations. In ordinary conditions, we have no conception how much our thinking, feeling, and moving functions depend upon one another, although we know at the same time how much our moods and our emotional states can depend upon our movements and postures. If a man takes a posture which with him corresponds to a feeling of sadness or despondency, then within a short time he is sure to feel sad or despondent. Fear, disgust, nervous agitation, or on the other hand, calm, can be created by an intentional change of posture. But as each of man's functions, thinking, emotional, and moving, has its own definite repertory, all of which are in constant interaction, a man can never get out of the charmed circle of his postures. Even if a man recognizes this and begins to struggle with it, his will is not sufficient. You must understand that a man's will can be sufficient to govern one center for a short time, but the other two centers prevent this, and a man's will can never be sufficient to govern three centers. In order to oppose this automatism and gradually to acquire control over postures and movements in different centers, there is one special exercise. It consists in this, that at a word or sign previously agreed upon from the teacher, all the pupils who hear or see him have to arrest their movements at once, no matter what they are doing, and remain stock still in the posture in which the signal has caught them. Moreover, not only must they cease to move, but they must keep their eyes on the same spot at which they were looking at the moment of the signal, retain the smile on their faces if there was one, keep the mouth open if a man was speaking, maintain the facial expression and the tension of all the muscles of the body exactly in the same position in which they were caught by the signal. In this stopped state, a man must also stop the flow of his thoughts and concentrate the whole of his attention on preserving the tension of the muscles in the various parts of the body exactly as it was, watching this tension all the time and leading, so to speak, his attention from one part of the body to another. And he must remain in this state and in this position until another agreed upon signal allows him to adopt a customary posture, or until he drops from fatigue through being unable to preserve the original posture any longer. But he has no right to change anything in it, neither his glance, points of support, nothing. If he cannot stand, he must fall, but again, he should fall like a sack without attempting to protect himself from a blow. In exactly the same way, if he was holding something in his hand, he must hold it as long as he can, and if his hands refuse to obey him and the object falls, it is not his fault. It is the duty of the teacher to see that no personal injury occurs from falling or from unaccustomed postures, and in this connection the pupils must trust the teacher fully and not think of any danger. The idea of this exercise and its results differ very much. Let us take it first of all from the point of view of the study of movements and postures. This exercise forbids a man the possibility of getting out of the circle of automatism, and it cannot be dispensed with, especially at the beginning of work of oneself. A non-mechanical study of oneself is only possible with the help of the stop exercise under the direction of a man who understands it. Let us try to follow what occurs. A man is walking or sitting or working. At a moment he hears a signal. A movement that has begun is interrupted by the sudden signal or command to stop. His body becomes immovable and arrested in the midst of a transition from one posture to another in a position in which he never stays in ordinary life. Feeling himself in this state, that is, in an unaccustomed posture, a man involuntarily looks at himself from a new point of view, sees and observes himself in a new way. In this unaccustomed posture, he is able to think in a new way, feel in a new way, know himself in a new way. In this way, the circle of old automatism is broken. The body tries in vain to adopt an ordinary, comfortable posture, but the man's will, brought into action by the will of the teacher, prevents it. The struggle goes on, not for life, but till the death. The struggle goes on, not for life, but till the death. But in this case, will can conquer. This exercise, taken together with all that has been said, is an exercise for self-remembering. A man must remember himself so as not to miss the signal. He must remember himself so as not to take the most comfortable posture at the first moment. He must remember himself in order to watch the tension of the muscles in different parts of the body, the direction in which he is looking, the facial expression, and so on. He must remember himself in order to overcome very considerable pain, sometimes from unaccustomed positions of the legs, arms, and back, so as not to be afraid of falling or dropping something heavy on his foot. It is enough to forget oneself for a single moment, and the body will adopt by itself, and almost unnoticeably, a more comfortable position. It will transfer the weight from one foot to another, will slacken certain muscles, and so on. This exercise is a simultaneous exercise for the will, the attention, the thoughts, the feelings, and for moving center. But it must be understood that in order to bring into action a sufficient strength of will to keep a man in an unaccustomed position, an order or command from the outside, stop, is indispensable. A man cannot give himself the command stop. His will not obey this command. The reason for this, as I have said before, is that the combination of habitual thinking, feeling, and moving postures is stronger than a man's will. The command stop, which in relation to moving postures comes from outside, takes the place of thinking and feeling postures. These postures and their influence are, so to speak, removed by the command stop, and in this case, moving postures obey the will. Soon after that, G began to put stop, as we call this exercise, into practice in the most varied circumstances. G, first of all, showed us how to stand stock still immediately at the command stop, and to try not to move, not to look aside no matter what was happening, not to reply if anyone spoke, for instance, if one were asked something or even unjustly accused of something. The stop exercise is considered sacred in schools, he said. Nobody except the principal teacher or the person he commissions has the right to command a stop. Stop cannot be the subject of play or exercise among the pupils. You never know the position a man can find himself in. If you cannot feel for him, you do not know what muscles are tensed or how much. Meanwhile, if a difficult tension is continued, it can cause the rupture of some important vessel, and in some cases it can even cause immediate death. Therefore, only he who is quite certain in himself that he knows what he is doing can allow himself to command a stop. At the same time, stop demands unconditional obedience without any hesitations or doubts, and this makes it the invariable method for studying school discipline. School discipline is something quite different from military discipline, for instance. In that discipline, everything is mechanical, and the more mechanical it is, the better. In this, everything should be conscious, because the aim consists in awakening consciousness. And for many people, school discipline is much more difficult than military discipline. There it is always one and the same. Here it is always different. But very difficult cases occur. I will tell you of one case in my own life. It was many years ago in Central Asia. We had put up a tent by the side of an arik, that is, an irrigation canal, and 3 of us were carrying things from one side of the arik to the other where our tents were. The water in the arik came up to our waists. I and another man had just come out onto the bank with some things and were preparing to dress. The 3rd man was still in the water. He dropped something in the water. We afterwards found out that it was an axe, and he was feeling about at the bottom with a stick. At this moment we heard from the tent a voice which called, "Stop!" We both stood stock still on the bank as we were. Our comrade in the water was just within our field of vision. He was standing, bending down towards the water, and when he heard "stop," he remained in that posture. 1 or 2 minutes passed by, and suddenly we saw that the water in the arik was rising. Someone, perhaps a mile away, had opened a sluice to let water into the small arik. The water rose very rapidly and soon reached the chin of the man in the water. We did not know if the man in the tent knew that the water was rising. We could not call out to him. We could not even turn our heads to see where he was. We could not look at each other. I could only hear my friend breathing. The water began to rise very rapidly, and soon the head of the man in the water was completely covered. Only one hand was raised, supported by a long staff. Only this hand was to be seen. It seemed to me that a very long time passed by. At length we heard, "Enough!" We both sprang into the water and dragged our friend out of it. He had been almost suffocated. We also very soon became convinced that the stop exercise was not at all a joke. In the first place, it required us to be constantly on the alert, constantly ready to interrupt what we were saying or doing, and secondly, it sometimes required endurance and determination of quite a special kind. Stop occurred at any moment of the day. Once during tea, P, who was sitting opposite me, had raised to his lips a glass of hot tea, just poured out, and was blowing on it. At this moment we heard "Stop!" from the next room. P's face and his hand holding the glass were just in front of my eyes. I saw him grow purple, and I saw a little muscle near his eye quiver, but he held on to the glass. He said afterwards that his fingers only pained him during the first minute, and the chief difficulty afterwards was with his arm, which was bent awkwardly at the elbow, that is, stopped halfway through a movement. But he had large blisters on his fingers, and they were painful for a long time. Another time, a stop caught Z when he had just inhaled smoke from his cigarette. He said afterwards that never in his life had he experienced anything so unpleasant. He could not exhale the smoke, and he sat with eyes full of tears and smoke slowly coming out of his mouth. Stop had an immense influence on the whole of our life, on the understanding of our work and our attitude towards it. First of all, attitude towards stop showed with undoubted accuracy what anyone's attitude was to the work. People who had tried to evade work evaded stop. That is, either they did not hear the command to stop, or they said that it did not directly refer to them, or, on the other hand, they were always prepared for a stop. They made no careless movements. They took no glasses of hot tea in their hands. They sat down and got up very quickly, and so on. To a certain extent, it was even possible to cheat with the stop. But of course, this would be seen and would at once show who was sparing himself and who was able not to spare himself, able to take the work seriously, and who was trying to apply ordinary methods to it, to avoid difficulties, to adapt themselves. In exactly the same way, stop showed the people who were incapable and undesirous of submitting to school discipline and the people who were not taking it seriously. We saw quite clearly that without stop and other exercises which accompanied it, nothing whatever could be attained in a purely psychological way. But later work showed us the methods of the psychological way. The chief difficulty for most people, as soon as it appeared, was the habit of talking. No one saw this habit in himself. No one could struggle with it, because it was always connected with some characteristic which the man considered to be positive in himself. Either he wanted to be sincere, or he wanted to know what another man thought, or he wanted to help someone by speaking of himself or of others, and so on and so on. I very soon saw that the struggle with the habit of talking, of speaking in general, more than is necessary, could become the center of gravity of work on oneself, because this habit touched everything, penetrated everything, and was, for many people, the least noticed. It was very curious to observe how this habit, I say habit simply for lack of another word, it would be more correct to say this sin or this misfortune, at once took possession of everything, no matter what a man might begin to do. In Essentuki at that time, G made us, among other things, carry out a small experiment in fasting. I had carried out experiments of this kind before, and a good deal was familiar to me, but for many others the feeling of days which were endlessly long, of complete emptiness, of a kind of futility of existence, was new. "Well, now I clearly understand," said one of our people, "what we live for, and the place that food occupies in our lives." But I personally was particularly interested in observing the place that talk occupied in life. In my opinion, our first fast consisted in everybody talking without stopping for several days about the fast. That is, everybody spoke about himself. In this respect, I remember very clearly talks with a Moscow friend about the fact that voluntary silence could be the most severe discipline to which a man could subject himself. But at that time we meant absolute silence. Even into this, G brought that wonderfully practical element which distinguished his system and his methods from anything I had known previously. "Complete silence is easier," he said, when I began once to tell him my ideas. "Complete silence is simply a way out of life. A man should be in the desert or in a monastery. We speak of work in life. A man can keep silence in such a way that no one will even notice it. The whole point is that we say a good deal too much. If we limited ourselves to what is actually necessary, this alone would be keeping silence. And it is the same with everything else, with food, with pleasures, with sleep. With everything there is a limit to what is necessary. After this, sin begins. This is something that must be grasped. A sin is something which is not necessary. But if people abstain from everything that is unnecessary now at once, what will the whole of life become like?" I said. "And how can they know what is necessary and what is not necessary?" "Again, you speak in your own way," said G. "I was not talking of people at all. They are going nowhere, and for them there are no sins. Sins are what keep a man on one spot if he has decided to move, and if he is able to move. Sins exist only for people who are on the way or approaching the way. And then sin is what stops a man, helps him to deceive himself and to think that he is working when he is simply asleep. Sin is what puts a man to sleep when he has already decided to awaken. And what puts a man to sleep? Again, everything that is unnecessary, everything that is not indispensable. The indispensable is always permitted, but beyond this hypnosis begins at once. But you must remember that this refers only to people in the work, or to those who consider themselves in the work. And work consists in subjecting oneself voluntarily to temporary suffering in order to be free from eternal suffering. But people are afraid of suffering. They want pleasure now, at once and forever. They do not want to understand that pleasure is an attribute of paradise and that it must be earned. And this is necessary not by reason of any arbitrary or inner moral laws, but because if man gets pleasure before he has earned it, he will not be able to keep it, and pleasure will be turned into suffering. But the whole point is to be able to get pleasure and to be able to keep it. Whoever can do this has nothing to learn. But the way to it lies through suffering. Whoever thinks that as he is, he can avail himself of pleasure is much mistaken, and if he is capable of being sincere with himself, then the moment will come when he will see this. But I will return to the physical exercises we carried out at that time. G showed us the different methods that were used in schools. Very interesting but unbelievably difficult were exercises in which a whole series of consecutive movements were performed in connection with taking the attention from one part of the body to another. For instance, a man sits on the ground with knees bent and holding his arms, with the palms of the hands close together between his feet. Then he has to lift one leg and during this time count Om, 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 up to the 10th Om, and then 9 times Om, 8 times Om, 7 times Om, and so on, down to 1, and then again twice Om, 3 times Om, and so on, and at the same time sense his right eye. Then separate the thumb and sense his left ear, and so on and so on. It was necessary first to remember the order of the movements and sensing, then, not to go wrong in the counting, to remember the count of movements and sensing. This was very difficult, but it did not end the affair. When a man had mastered this exercise and could do it, say, for about 10 or 15 minutes, he was given in addition a special form of breathing, namely, he must inhale while pronouncing Om several times, and exhale pronouncing Om several times. Moreover, the count had to be made aloud. Beyond this, there were still greater and greater complications of the exercise up to almost impossible things, and G told us he had seen people who, for days, did exercises of this kind. The short fast of which I spoke was also accompanied by special exercises. In the first place, G explained at the beginning of the fast that the difficulty in fasting consisted in not leaving unused the substances which were prepared in the organism for the digestion of food. These substances consist of very strong solutions, he said, and if they are left without attention, they will poison the organism. They must be used up. But how can they be used up if the organism gets no food? Only by an increase of work, an increase of perspiration. People make a tremendous mistake when they try to save their strength, make fewer movements, and so on, when fasting. On the contrary, it is necessary to expend as much energy as possible. Then fasting can be beneficial. And when we began our fast, we were not left in peace for a single second. G made us run in the heat, doing a round of 2 miles, or stand with extended arms, or mark time at the double, or carry out a whole series of curious gymnastic exercises which he showed us. And he, all the time, constantly said that these exercises we were doing were not real ones, but merely preliminary and preparatory exercises. One experiment in connection with what G said about breathing and fatigue explained many things to me, and chiefly it explained why it is so difficult to attain anything in the ordinary conditions of life. I had gone to a room where nobody could see me and began to mark time at the double, trying at the same time to breathe according to a particular count, that is, to inhale during a definite number of steps and exhale during a definite number. After a certain time, when I had begun to tire, I noticed, that is, to speak more correctly, I felt quite clearly that my breathing was artificial and unreliable. I felt that in a very short time I would be unable to breathe in that way while continuing to mark time at the double, and that ordinary normal breathing, very accelerated of course, without any count, would gain the upper hand. It became more and more difficult for me to breathe and to mark time, and to observe the count of breaths and steps. I was pouring with sweat, my head began to turn round, and I thought I should fall. I began to despair of obtaining results of any kind, and I'd almost stopped when suddenly something seemed to crack or move inside me, and my breathing went on evenly and properly at the rate I wanted it to go, but without any effort on my part, while affording me all the amount of air I needed. It was an extraordinarily pleasant sensation. I shut my eyes and continued to mark time, breathing easily and freely and feeling exactly as though strength was increasing in me and that I was getting lighter and stronger. I thought that if I could continue to run in this way for a certain time, I should get still more interesting results, because waves of a sort of joyful trembling had already begun to go through my body, which, as I knew from previous experiments, preceded what I called the opening of the inner consciousness. But at this moment someone came into the room, and I stopped. Afterwards my heart beat strongly for a long time, but not unpleasantly. I had marked time and breathed for about half an hour. I do not recommend this exercise to people with weak hearts. At all events, this experiment showed me with accuracy that a given exercise could be transferred to the moving center, that is, that it was possible to make the moving center work in a new way. But at the same time, I was convinced that the condition for this transition was extreme fatigue. A man begins any exercise with his mind. Only when the last stage of fatigue is reached can the control pass to the moving center. This explained what G had said about super efforts and made many of his later requirements intelligible. But afterwards, however much I tried, I did not succeed in repeating the experiment, that is to say, in evoking the same sensations. It is true that the fast had come to an end and that the success of my experiment had been, to a considerable extent, connected with it. When I told G about this experiment, he said that without general work, that is, without work on the whole organism, such things could only succeed by chance. Later on, I several times heard descriptions of experiences very similar to mine from people who were studying dances and dervish movements with G. The more we saw and realized the complexity and the diversity of methods of work on oneself, the clearer became for us the difficulties of the way. We saw the indispensability of great knowledge, of immense efforts, and of help, such as no one of us either could or had the right to count upon. We saw that even to begin work on oneself in any serious form was an exceptional phenomenon, needing thousands of favorable inner and outward conditions. The beginning gave no guarantee for the future. Each step required an effort. Each step needed help. The possibility of attaining anything seemed so small in comparison with the difficulties that many of us lost the desire to make efforts of any kind. This was an inevitable stage through which everybody passes until they have learned to understand that it is useless to think of the possibility or impossibility of big and distant achievements, and that a man must value what he gets today without thinking of what he may get tomorrow. But certainly the idea of the difficulty and the exclusiveness of the way was right, and at different times questions arose out of which were put to G. Can it be possible that there is any difference between us and those people who have no conception of this system? Must we understand that people who are not passing along any of the ways are doomed to turn eternally in one and the same circle, that they are merely food for the moon, that they have no escape and no possibilities? Is it correct to think that there are no ways outside the ways, and how it is arranged that some people, much better people perhaps, do not come across a way, while others, weak and insignificant, come into contact with the possibilities of a way? On one occasion, while talk was proceeding on these subjects, to which we were constantly returning, G began to talk in a somewhat different way to what he had done before, because he had previously always insisted on the fact that outside the ways there was nothing. There is not, and there cannot be any choice of the people who come into touch with the ways. In other words, nobody selects them. They select themselves, partly by accident and partly by having a certain hunger. Whoever is without this hunger cannot be helped by accident, and whoever has this hunger very strongly can be brought by accident to the beginning of a way in spite of all unfavorable circumstances. But what of those who were killed and who died from disease in the war, for instance? Someone asked. Could not many of them have had this hunger? And how then could this hunger have helped? That is an entirely different thing, said G. These people came under general law. We do not speak of them, and we cannot. We can only speak of people who, thanks to chance or fate or their own cleverness, do not come under a general law, that is, who stay outside the action of any general law of destruction. For instance, it is known through statistics that a certain definite number of people have to fall under trams in Moscow during the year. Then, if a man, even one with a great hunger, falls under a tram and the tram crushes him, we can no longer speak of him from the point of view of work on the ways. We can speak only of those who are alive, and only while they are alive. Trams or war, they are exactly the same thing. One is merely larger, the other smaller. We are speaking of those who do not fall under trams. A man, if he is hungry, has a chance to come into contact with the beginning of a way. But besides hunger, still other roles are necessary. Otherwise, a man will not see the way. Imagine that an educated European, that is, a man who knows nothing about religion, comes into touch with the possibility of a religious way. He will see nothing, and he will understand nothing. For him, it will be stupidity and superstition. But at the same time, he may have a great hunger, though formulated intellectually. It is exactly the same thing for a man who has never heard of yoga methods, of development of consciousness, and so on. For him, if he comes into touch with the yoga way, everything he hears will be dead. The fourth way is still more difficult. In order to give the fourth way a right valuation, a man must have thought and felt and been disappointed in many things beforehand. He ought, if not actually to have tried the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, and the way of the yogi previously, at least to have known and thought about them, and to be convinced that they are no good for him. It is not necessary to understand what I say literally. This thinking process can be unknown to the man himself, but the results of this process must be in him, and only they can help him to recognize the fourth way. Otherwise, he can stand very near to it and not see it. But it is certainly wrong to say that unless a man enters one of these ways, he has no more chances. Ways are simply help given to people according to their type. At the same time, the accelerated ways, the ways of personal, individual evolution, as distinct from general evolution, can precede it, can lead up to it, but in any case, they are distinct from it. Whether general evolution is proceeding or not is again another question. It is enough for us to realize that it is possible, and therefore evolution for people outside the ways is possible. Speaking more correctly, there are two ways. One we call the subjective way. It includes all four ways of which we have spoken. The other we will call the objective way. This is the way of people in life. You must not take the names subjective and objective too literally. They express only one aspect. I take them only because there are no other words. Would it be possible to say individual and general ways? Asked someone. No, said G. It would be more incorrect than subjective and objective, because the subjective way is not individual in the general meaning of this word, because this way is a school way. From this point of view, the objective way is much more individual, because it admits of many more individual peculiarities. No, it is better to leave these names, subjective and objective. They are not altogether suitable, but we will take them conditionally. People of the objective way simply live in life. They are those whom we call good people. Particular systems and methods are not necessary for them. Making use of ordinary religious or intellectual teachings and ordinary morality, they live at the same time according to conscience. They do not of necessity do much good, but they do no evil. Sometimes they happen to be quite uneducated, simple people, but they understand life very well. They have a right valuation of things and a right outlook, and they are of course perfecting themselves and evolving. Only their way can be very long, with many unnecessary repetitions. I had for a long time wanted to get G to talk about repetition, but he always avoided it. So it was on this occasion, without answering my question about repetition, he continued. It often seems to people of the way, that is, of the subjective way, especially those who are just beginning, that other people, that is, people of the objective way, are not moving. But this is a great mistake. A simple obivatel may sometimes do such work within him that he will overtake another, a monk or even a yogi. Obivatel is a strange word in the Russian language. It is used in the sense of inhabitant, without any particular shade. At the same time, it is used to express contempt or derision, obivatel, as though there could be nothing worse. But those who speak in this way do not understand that the obivatel is the healthy kernel of life. And from the point of view of the possibility of evolution, a good obivatel has many more chances than a lunatic or a tramp. Afterwards, I will perhaps explain what I mean by these two words. In the meantime, we will talk about the obivatel. I do not at all wish to say that all obivatels are people of the objective way. Nothing of the kind. Among them are thieves, rascals, and fools, but there are others. I merely wish to say that being a good obivatel by itself does not hinder the way. And finally, there are different types of obivatel. Imagine, for example, the type of obivatel who lives all his life, just as the other people round him, conspicuous in nothing, perhaps a good master who makes money and is perhaps even closed-fisted. At the same time, he dreams all his life of monasteries, for instance, and dreams that at some time or other he will leave everything and go into a monastery. And such things happen in the East and in Russia. A man lives and works, then, when his children or his grandchildren are grown up, he gives everything to them and goes into a monastery. This is the obivatel of which I speak. Perhaps he does not go into a monastery. Perhaps he does not need this. His own life as an obivatel can be his way. People who are definitely thinking about ways, particularly people of intellectual ways, very often look down on the obivatel and, in general, despise the virtues of the obivatel. But they only show by this their own personal unsuitability for any way whatever, because no way can begin from a level lower than the obivatel. This is very often lost sight of on people who are unable to organize their own personal lives, who are too weak to struggle with and conquer life, dream of the ways, or what they consider are ways, because they think it will be easier for them than life, and because this, so to speak, justifies their weakness and their inadaptability. A man who can be a good obivatel is much more helpful from the point of view of the way than a tramp who thinks himself much higher than an obivatel. I call tramps all the so-called intelligentsia, artists, poets, any kind of bohemian in general who despises the obivatel and who, at the same time, would be unable to exist without him. Ability to orientate oneself in life is a very useful quality from the point of view of work. A good obivatel should be able to support at least 20 persons by his own labor. What is a man worth who is unable to do this? What does obivatel actually mean? Asks someone. Can it be said that an obivatel is a good citizen? Ought an obivatel to be patriotic? Someone else asked. Let us suppose there is war. What attitude should an obivatel have towards war? There can be different wars and there can be different patriots, said G. You all still believe in words. An obivatel, if he is a good obivatel, does not believe in words. He realizes how much idle talk is hidden behind them. People who shout about their patriotism are psychopaths for him, and he looks upon them as such. And how would an obivatel look upon pacifists or upon people who refuse to go to the war? Equally as lunatics. They are probably still worse. On another occasion, in connection with the same question, G said, a good deal is incomprehensible to you because you do not take into account the meaning of some of the most simple words. For instance, you have never thought what to be serious means. Try to give yourselves an answer to the question what being serious means. To have a serious attitude towards things, someone said. That is exactly what everyone thinks. Actually, it is exactly the reverse, said G. To have a serious attitude towards things does not at all mean being serious, because the principal question is towards what things? Very many people have a serious attitude towards trivial things. Can they be called serious? Of course not. The mistake is that the concept serious is taken conditionally. One thing is serious for a man and another thing for another man. In reality, seriousness is one of the concepts which can never and under no circumstances be taken conditionally. Only one thing is serious for all people at all times. A man may be more aware of it or less aware of it, but the seriousness of things will not alter on this account. If a man could understand all the horror of the lives of ordinary people who are turning round in a circle of insignificant interests and insignificant aims, if he could understand what they are losing, he would understand that there can be only one thing that is serious for him: to escape from the general law, to be free. What can be serious for a man in prison who is condemned to death? Only one thing: how to save himself, how to escape. Nothing else is serious. When I say an obivitel is more serious than a tramp or a lunatic, I mean by this that, accustomed to deal with real values, an obivitel values the possibilities of the ways and the possibilities of liberation or salvation better and quicker than a man who is accustomed all his life to a circle of imaginary values, imaginary interests, and imaginary possibilities. People who are not serious for the obivitel are people who live by fantasies, chiefly by the fantasy that they are able to do something. The obivitel knows that they only deceive people, promise them God knows what, and that actually they are simply arranging affairs for themselves, or they are lunatics, which is still worse. In other words, they believe everything that people say. To what category do politicians belong who speak contemptuously about obivitel's opinions, obivitel's interests? Someone asked. They are the worst kind of obivitels, said G, that is, obivitels without any positive redeeming features, or they are charlatans, lunatics, or knaves. But may there not be honest and decent people among politicians? Someone asked. Certainly there may be, said G, but in this case they are not practical people. They are dreamers, and they will be used by other people as screens to cover their own obscure affairs. The obivitel perhaps may not know it in a philosophical way, that is to say, he is not able to formulate it, but he knows that things do themselves, simply through his own practical shrewdness. Therefore, in his heart, he laughs at people who think or who want to assure him that they signify anything, that anything depends on their decisions, that they can change or, in general, do anything. This for him is not being serious, and an understanding of what is not serious can help him to value that which is serious. And I suppose it's a serious question what Gurdjieff's talking about, that we must have an aim. Previous chapters and several times he said, without an aim, you don't know where you're going, you don't know what direction you're going. And here I believe he's saying that, we must take this spiritual aim of raising consciousness, of awakening. This must be the most serious thing. And hopefully once one has been connected with these ideas for some time and realizes that, I don't know about nothing else matters, but this matters the most, and this sort of impacts every aspect of one's life, and so you can this impacts every other aspect of your life. So all your other aims, in a sense, are subsumed by this aim of higher consciousness, higher being, waking up. It affects everything. And hello there, 161157, Gore, welcome and good morning. And hello there, Jennifer, who says her son is enjoying this book at bedtime, and your 13-year-old son is to have a mum like you who makes him aware of these ideas. He's got a bright future, I think. So I hope he's enjoying the readings, or I hope you are enjoying, if you're listening, Jennifer's son. And any questions, get them in the comments. We often return to questions on the difficulties of the way. Our own experience of communal life and work constantly threw us up against newer and newer difficulties that lay in ourselves. The whole thing is in being ready to sacrifice one's freedom, said G. A man consciously and unconsciously struggles for freedom as he imagines it, and this, more than anything else, prevents him from attaining real freedom. But a man who is capable of attaining anything comes sooner or later to the conclusion that his freedom is illusion, and he agrees to sacrifice this illusion. He voluntarily becomes a slave. He does what he is told, says what he is told, and thinks what he is told. He is not afraid of losing anything because he knows that he has nothing, and in this way he acquires everything. Everything in him that was real in his understanding, in his sympathies, tastes, and desires, all comes back to him, accompanied by new things which he did not have, and could not have had before, together with a feeling of unity and will within him. But to arrive at this point, a man must pass through the hard way of slavery and obedience, and if he wants results, he must obey not only outwardly, but inwardly. This requires a great determination, and determination requires a great understanding of the fact that there is no other way, that a man can do nothing himself, but that at the same time, something has to be done. When a man comes to the conclusion that he cannot and does not desire to live any longer in the way he has lived till then, when he really sees everything that his life is made up of and decides to work, he must be truthful with himself in order not to fall into a still worse position. Because there is nothing worse than to begin work on oneself and then leave it and find oneself between two stools. It is much better not to begin, and in order not to begin in vain or risk being deceived on one's own account, a man should test his decision many times. And principally he must know how far he is willing to go and what he is willing to sacrifice. There is nothing more easy to say than everything. A man can never sacrifice everything, and this can never be required of him. But he must define exactly what he is willing to sacrifice and not bargain about it afterwards, or it will be the same with him as with the wolf in the Armenian fairy tale. Do you know the Armenian fairy tale of the wolf and the sheep? And here is that fairy tale. Once there lived a wolf who slaughtered a great many sheep and reduced many people to tears. At length, I do not know why, he suddenly felt qualms of conscience and began to repent his life, so he decided to reform and to slaughter no more sheep. In order to do this seriously, he went to a priest and asked him to hold a Thanksgiving service. The priest began the service, and the wolf stood weeping and praying in the church. The service was long. The wolf had slaughtered many of the sheep's priest. Therefore the priest prayed earnestly that the wolf would indeed reform. Suddenly the wolf looked through a window and saw that the sheep were being driven home. He began to fidget, but the priest went on and on without end. At last the wolf could contain himself no longer, and he shouted, "Finish it, priest, or all the sheep will be driven home, and I shall be left without supper." This is a very good fairy tale, because it describes man very well. He is ready to sacrifice everything, but after all, today's dinner is a different manner. A man always wishes to begin with something big, but this is impossible. There can be no choice. We must begin with the things of today. I quote one talk as being a very characteristic example of G's methods. We were walking in the park. There were 5 of us besides G. One of us asked him what his views on astrology were, whether there was anything of value in the more or less known theories of astrology. "Yes," said G. "It depends upon how they are understood. They can be of value and they can be without value. Astrology deals with only one part of man, with his type, his essence. It does not deal with personality, with acquired qualities. If you understand this, you understand what is of value in astrology." There had been talks in our groups about types before, and it seemed to us that the science of types was the most difficult thing in the study of man because G gave us very little material and required of us our own observations of ourselves and others. We continued to walk and G continued to speak, trying to explain what there was in man that could depend upon planetary influences and what could not. As we left the park, G stopped talking and was going a few steps ahead of us. We 5 walked behind him talking together. In going round a tree, G dropped the stick, ebony with a Caucasian silver handle, he was carrying, and one of us bent down, picked it up and gave it to him. G walked on for a few steps, then turned to us and said, "That was astrology. Do you understand? You all saw me drop the stick. Why did one of you pick it up? Let each of you speak for himself." One said he had not seen G drop the stick as he was looking another way. The second said that he had noticed that G had not dropped the stick accidentally, as happens when a stick gets caught in something, but that he had intentionally loosened his hand and let the stick fall. This had excited his curiosity, and he had waited to see what would happen next. The third said he saw G drop the stick, but was very absorbed in thinking of astrology, particularly trying to remember what G said once before, and did not pay sufficient attention to the stick. The fourth saw the stick fall and thought of picking it up, but at that moment the other picked up the stick and gave it to G. The fifth said he saw the stick fall, and then he saw himself picking it up and giving it to G. G smiled as he listened to us. "This is astrology," he said. "In the same situation, one man sees and does one thing, another thing, a third thing, and so on, and each one acted according to his type. Observe people and yourselves in this way, and then perhaps we will afterwards talk of a different astrology." The time passed by very quickly. The short Essentuki summer was drawing to a close. We had begun to think of the winter and to make a variety of plans. And suddenly everything changed. For a reason that seemed to me to be accidental, and which was the result of friction between certain members of our small group, G announced that he was dispersing the whole group and stopping all work. At first we simply did not believe him, thinking he was putting us to a test. And when he said he was going to the Black Sea coast with Z alone, all excepting a few of us who had to return to Moscow or Petersburg announced that they would follow him wherever he went. G consented to this, but he said that we must look after ourselves and that there would be no work, no matter how much we counted on it. All this surprised me very much. I considered the moment most inappropriate for acting, and if what G said was serious, then why had the whole business been started? During this period nothing new had appeared in us, and if G had started work with us, such as we were, then why was he stopping it now? This altered nothing for me materially. I had decided to pass the winter in the Caucasus in any case, but it changed a good many things for some of the other members of our group who were still slightly uncertain and made the difficulty for them insuperable. And I have to confess that my confidence in G began to waver from this moment. What the matter was and what particularly provoked me is difficult for me to define even now. But the fact is that from this moment there began to take place in me a separation between G himself and his ideas. Until then I had not separated them. At the end of August I at first followed G to Torps, and from there went to Petersburg with the intention of bringing back some things. Unfortunately, I had to leave behind all my books. I thought at the time that I would be risking very much to take them to the Caucasus, but in Petersburg, of course, everything was lost. And so that was chapter 17 for you all. I hope you enjoyed it, and again, like I mentioned in the introduction, you see there that Gurdjieff has decided to sort of abandon the work, to close it all down. And doing this, Ouspensky has felt, himself becoming distant from Gurdjieff. And you'll see in chapter 18 that this divide widens, and at the end he ends up beginning his own Ouspensky founds his own group, if you like, and it was very interesting when I first began. I became part of the Gurdjieff side, and it was all very, sort of tribal, That's the Ouspensky group over there, and they don't do things seriously. And of course, the Ouspensky group would say, I'm sure they recognize that the Gurdjieff group is the authentic, but just like all religions, they bifurcate. And so, as with Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, they went their separate ways. And it's just very interesting to observe. For me, as I'm sharing all the time, and why we've started with In Search of the Miraculous, I feel that Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, is the best portrayal and the most general and broad perspective of the ideas. Like I say, I don't expect anyone to start with Maurice Nicole's commentaries or with Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales, because that will be sort of insuperable. You wouldn't you wouldn't be able to progress. But I think with In Search of the Miraculous, you can, with time, and especially with the fourth way as supplementary material, you can progress and you can learn about these ideas and begin to make observations and, some experiments of yourself in your life. But yes, chapter 17, one more chapter to go, and you'll see in conclusion that Ouspensky decides not to go with Gurdjieff to Fontainebleau and the Prairie. Gore says he stopped in the work in effect, and maybe you could say that, yes, and I think that's a fair point. Gore, I'm going to call you Gore if you don't mind, because all the numbers make things difficult. But I think you're right, and I think that's a fair point that he stopped in the work, because I think without Gurdjieff, it can become imagination, and it can become sort of fantasy work. You're not actually doing the work. So I think that the people that were in Fontainebleau with Gurdjieff were working, and sort of Ouspensky was intellectualizing. He was in his mind. He had a very active intellectual center, and he was in his mind. And there's a story about Alfred Orage, I believe it was, who went to America to develop the ideas and to develop sort of a work center over there. And I think it's in Gurdjieff's book, Life is Only Real Then When I Am, that he talks about it. And there's also another book, Gurdjieff and Orage, that documents it more clearly. But Gurdjieff went over to America, and it was quite a big group, hundreds of people and regular meetings and stuff. And Gurdjieff went and he said, "You guys have misunderstood everything. You're emphasizing the wrong things. You haven't taught it properly, so shut it all down." And of course, Orage was pretty upset about this, because he felt he'd done his best to develop this institute, if you like, in America. And Gurdjieff just said, nah, you've done it all wrong. We're going to have to start again. And so, yeah, I think it's a fair point that he stopped the work, but it wasn't the work that he then was doing. It was something different. But I think all of the characters that orbit Gurdjieff, for example, Ouspensky, Orage, like I've mentioned, Maurice Nicole, C.S. Knott, and all the others, Czeslaw Czechovic, all of the people that were orbiting him have a story to tell. And it's only, in my opinion, by absorbing the whole solar system of G's world and his life through these other biographies and other interpretations of the ideas, or not only by, but if you want the full view, you have to read all of these materials so that you can get the full picture, the 360 view. And if you were just to read one book, you get just a small view. And but I think you're right there, Gore, again. G did achieve his aim. I think so. I think his books are a big part of it, his All and Everything series. And I think, when we finally come to study Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, that will be a fascinating study. And, will cause a lot of food for thought, and a lot of contemplation will be required. But that's all for today. I might be back later on. I don't know if I'll do chapter 18 or maybe another short story from F. Scott Fitzgerald. I haven't decided yet. But if you'd like to see another reading, let me know in the comments. And hopefully I'll be back later with another reading, whatever that might be. I don't know yet. Who knows? But thanks for joining. It's lovely to see everyone enjoying this book by Ouspensky, and his documenting his time with Gurdjieff. And once we've finished In Search of the Miraculous, one more chapter left, we're going to begin with Gurdjieff's own writing meetings with remarkable men. So I look forward to beginning that. Look after yourselves, everyone. Have a good week, and I'll see you next time. Bye, guys. Take care now.